we're live now, so welcome everyone. Welcome to this APIsecure conference roundtable discussion on managing your security posture across your software supply chain. I'm Dana Gardner, Director of Content at Traceable AI, and I'll be your moderator for this live discussion on the risks and rewards of developing with and deploying on openly available software and services. Before we introduce our guests, please know that we welcome your comments and questions. Simply add them here to your virtual conference interface chat, and we'll address them as best we can. We'll also have a dedicated question and answer session at the end of our discussion. With that, please join me now in welcoming our guests. We're here with Christian Folini, security engineer at Netnea and an open source project manager. Welcome, Christian.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dana.
We're glad you're with us. We're also here with Jim Hietela. He's Vice President of Business Development and Security at the Open Group. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Dana. Good to be here.
And we're here with Sudeep Padiyar. He's founding member of the product management team at Traceable AI. Thank you for being here, Sudeep.
Hey, Dana. Glad to be here.
And we're also here with Dave Linthicum, Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte Consulting. Good to have you with us, Dave.
Great to be here, Dana.
So, you know, the past few years have seen a troubling increase in the attacks exploiting weaknesses in upstream open source software, from SolarWinds to even lately Spring for Shell. Yet nowadays, open source software and third-party APIs form an ever-growing portion of new applications and services, from core essential IT infrastructure to mobile widgets. So the task before us is to continue getting the most out of this vast open source ocean and resources, as well as the API ecosystem, by leveraging the right tools, methods, and frameworks so that we can observe, identify, and minimize the risks. The stakes are obviously extremely high for getting this right and for keeping it right for the foreseeable future. So let me start with you, Jim Hietela. You've been working within communities on security standards for many years. How serious is the open source and overall software supply chain security problem?
Yeah, it's funny, Dana. We've been doing this for specifically supply chain security for, say, 10 years. We started something called the Open Trusted Technology Forum 10 years ago. And at that time, I would have said it was more theoretical than real. Today, I don't think that's the case. I think it is clearly a real set of threats that organizations have to contend with. And our business is taking it seriously enough at this point. I would say some IT vendors are. I don't think generally large enterprises really are taking the threats that come from supply chain attacks and open source and APIs as seriously as they need to.
How, in your estimation, has it gotten worse? Is it the number of attacks, the type of attacks, all the above?
Yeah, I think it's all the above. It's that the things that were theoretical 10 years ago actually have happened with SolarWinds and some other attacks on IT vendors, that really take advantage of supply chain issues that they've had. So,
and when you say that businesses don't necessarily take it seriously enough, is this a function of them not being aware that it's going on, that they have people lurking in their networks without their awareness, or are they overwhelmed? Why won't they get perhaps a bit more diligent?
Yeah, I'd be curious on the other panelists' views on this. I do think, people who head up security at large enterprises have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of threats coming at them, and this is just one. I will say it's hard to miss that some of the really highest impact attacks that we've had have come through this threat vector. So,
now, Christian, you run a successful open source web application project, so you certainly see a lot of adoption of open source software. Do you see the foothold of open source expanding, or do you see the industry reacting to these threats in some way that's decreasing the popularity or utility of open source?
No, I certainly see it expanding. And I mean, it's been expanding for 20, 30 years, as long as it's been around, much to surprise so many people. However, if you are within the movement, if you run an open source project, you can certainly see the advantages. I'm running a web application firewall project. We're like literally the only open source offering in this regard. So we have a nearly dominant place in our niche, and it's very hard for an enterprise to compete with us. I mean, the knowledge is hard to come by. These engineers able to really provide this are expensive, rare to find, and we're a thriving open source community. So we source information, knowledge from all over the place, and we put it out for free. So it's hard for an enterprise to compete with us. So they simply adopt our stuff. And that comes with a risk of running something that you don't necessarily understand. It's so easy to just unbox it, run it, even sell it to your customers without really having a deeper understanding of what you're actually selling to your customers. So I think there is an inherent risk in running open source because it's so easy very often. And there's not really something like a free lunch. So you still have to do your due diligence, but it's very easy to forget about it. And I think I see people waking up to this fact. I see more people interested in it. I see interest from commercial vendors packaging our software, asking us to be in touch, to talk to us. Could you please explain us what you think about our product? Or even can we sponsor you? Because we think you're very valuable and you're an important piece of our supply chain. So I think everything is getting more mature. And if I'm looking from a positive perspective, then this whole talk about supply chain sheds light on open source and the hundreds of packages that people source when they sell software. So I see the foothold expanding, and I also see people noticing the risk a bit better.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Dave Linthicum, you've been a long-term cloud industry observer. Has open source and development in public clouds, it's hard to separate them. I can't even think of public cloud that didn't have some sort of open source angle, particularly as for developers. Do you agree that this is the Pandora, the box is open, there's no going back?
No, there is no going back. But the thing is, it's an easy problem to solve that takes a lot more resources than people think. I love what Jim said earlier, that it's a matter of priorities that people have on everybody's plate. And certainly the cloud providers, you think about it, they're probably at the most risk because they can create security problems that are on demand that you have to subscribe and pay for. And at the end of the day, so you have to be extremely paranoid in terms of how you're dealing with your open source software supply chain and vetting the code that goes into the systems in the cloud. Fortunately, typically open source software needs to be truncate. Has to have a trunk to create the different cloud providing systems out there, because the multi-tenancy requirements and because the multi-factor authentication, the ability to deal with different threading issues and things like that. So something like that would have a chance to be spotted way before it becomes an issue. However, as you start sending things down from the supply chain and they're factoring into app systems that are already built using open source software, and we're assuming that those particular components that we're getting from the open source upstream is going to be secure and vetted and ready to go, those are assumptions you can make. And the thing is, they're dealing with systems that are becoming more complex and more laborious and very heavily engineered. And so we're going to have to expand the resources needed to watch out for these security threats. And that means that the price of public cloud software may go up a bit, even though we're consuming it on demand. And it's really people who may end up leveraging public cloud software because they feel they're doing a better job and vetting these threats than some of the more enterprise players that are doing direct software installations on premise.
Do you think, Dave, behaviorally that people have become complacent because of the ease of cloud services? They can just dial them up, use a credit card, get going, and they maybe don't think about all the repercussions. So is there something about the way the cloud has developed that has led to complacency about software use in general?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. In the early days of cloud computing, people were ultra paranoid. They figured the cloud was going to be unsafe and unsecure because they couldn't see it. And so they're very careful about what they put in the cloud and very careful about vetting the security things in the cloud. Keep in mind, and the cloud providers have always said this, it's a shared responsibility model when it comes to security. So you have to secure your data sets, you have to secure your applications, you have to leverage the proper mechanisms, you have to do so in a proper procedure, or else security isn't going to be guaranteed. So hopefully they're not presenting systemic security issues, that are part of their software supply chain and things that we're leveraging on the cloud. But The reality is the security testing, including testing for systemic supply chain issues, is really on that of the user. They need to keep an eye out for that. And so security testing that occurs in the cloud, even vetting their stuff and doing security checks and smoke testing and security testing, performance testing, all those sorts of things are on the end user. People don't realize that. And so if they are whistling past the graveyard in terms of not doing the responsible thing and monitoring these capabilities, and they're just asking for a problem going forward. And by the way, it probably won't be the fault of the cloud provider. It's going to be your fault as a cloud user and not using the cloud responsibly.
Sudeep, as a product management leader at Traceable, and as a security vendor, making sure that people have confidence and assurance is important. But as Dave just said, it's a lot of the burden falls on the user. So, one, how do you feel as a vendor in using open source? And two, how do you feel you can be able to help the users take more responsibility?
Yeah, no, Dana, as a security vendor, it's very, very important for us that, the first criteria that we take when we select any open source software is the security posture around it. What are the vulnerabilities in those libraries? So that is a primary criteria that we take while deciding whether to leverage some of the open source software or to actually build some of our own components. So we have our, the SaaS platform, which obviously leverages more open source components, and then we have our agents, which run in the context of the languages like Java or in the gateways. So we have a product security team. We have a bunch of security best practices that we essentially make sure that we go through, whether it is maintaining a source code inventory for all the open source software, tracking issues that we see in open source software, remediating audits. So we go through the whole 9 yards when it comes to making sure that the open source components that we use are actually not adding any more vulnerabilities. And that's the same thing that we did with Log4Shell and Spring4Shell. It was mainly ensuring that we had gone through the inventory first to make sure that our SaaS platform was secure. We also use products like Sneak, which do a pretty good job in scanning the source code, the SaaS part for the SCA, as well as continuously monitoring the exposure that we have to some of these over time. Now, being a security company, we also do dog fooding. So we do traceable and traceable to find the issues on the APIs early.
And because this is an API security conference, how do you view APIs as part of a supply chain? Do people take API use as seriously as other software, including open source? And maybe there's an opportunity or need for people to think a bit more seriously about the way they access and use APIs that are available across third parties and marketplaces and other resources.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And see, when it comes to APIs, there are two aspects to it, right? One is the security around the APIs itself, which goes around things on the authentication layer, as well as some of the business logic abuse that we see on the APIs. But it also goes back to the fact that there are several software components which go into building some of these APIs, right? So whether it is us or any other company, when they select the third-party APIs, one, they have to do the due diligence, make sure that they're understanding the risk that some of these APIs are exposing, and then constantly keeping pace with it, right? So having that inventory of third-party APIs that are using, checking against vulnerabilities that are coming in there, using some of the tooling which is already present, but more importantly, having that inventory and ensuring that if any vulnerabilities are showing up, then what is the alternate route or which versions of the APIs do they need to pick? All of that becomes important.
Yeah. So Jim Hietela, you've been a pioneer in zero trust over the years, and it was at one time sort of an outlying concept, but it seems to me that it makes a lot of sense to take a zero trust posture when you're thinking about your supply chain, your use of open source, how you leverage and exploit APIs. How does zero trust and what we're talking about in terms of ameliorating the risk come together?
Well, I think it can play a role here for sure. Zero trust architectures can help with supply chain security issues in the world of open source and APIs to the extent that standards are produced in this area. And they've not been there to date. You always have this concern in the security industry that the new buzzword becomes the thing that gets abused in the marketplace if there isn't clarity about what it, in this case, what zero trust actually means. What does it mean for a security product to include zero trust in its architecture? So I think zero trust and the assumption that you can't trust that other component is useful, and it will be useful in this world to the extent that standards are developed and then they're just supported by the entire ecosystem. So,
and I know there are many forums and projects at the Open Group, many of them dealing with security and supply chain. Are there any other activities that people should be aware of that they can bring into this mix to make themselves able to use these products, but doing so responsibly?
So inside of the Open Group, I would point to two. So there is a zero trust working group inside of our security forum that's working today primarily at an architectural level to help define with folks like NIST and others, what it means to be a zero trust security architecture supported by an enterprise, or what are the standards that are needed inside of various products. And then we also have, I might have mentioned earlier, the Trusted Technology Forum, which started doing supply chain security 10 years ago and did some good work in the area of supply chain security. But the context at the time was commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software being procured by governments, by the Department of Defense. There's a standard, there's a framework, there's a certification there. But we really didn't consider at the time open source nor APIs. So I think that there's a good foundation there. We'd love to have particularly end user organizations get involved in that work and maybe relook at that in the context of open source and APIs.
Yeah. Quickly, are there any major lessons that we can learn from what happened in organizations like the Department of Defense in the United States and others that we can apply here? Are there methodologies? Are there approaches, maybe even schools of thought that need to be extended from one area to another now that this has become a larger problem?
For me, having been involved in this sort of work for a while, the biggest lesson learned, not only from the Trusted Technology Forum, but other standards initiatives that we've done, is that the end users need to demonstrate some seriousness with respect to the requirements that they put into efforts like this in order to get the supply side of the ecosystem to really take it seriously. So we've had a lot of success where we've gotten the really large end users, whether it's the DoD or government, and gotten them seriously involved to the point of looking at procurements against standards, and you've got to have that whole cycle going to really achieve some progress. So,
hey, Christian, being involved on an open source project, there's some things that you have adapted or adopted to help you with continuous development, inventory, managing complexity, the interrelationships between software and its sources. Are there like tools or tricks of the trade that you may now be looking at more seriously than you did before?
It is a problem that doesn't really apply to the project I'm running. We have a very small footprint when it comes to dependencies for whatever reason, but we're part of the larger OWASP family, so the Open Web Application Security Project. We're one of the flagship projects, and there are other OWASP projects that have been designed and invented especially for this problem. Notably, the OWASP Dependency Jack, which has been around for several years. And we see Cyclone DX, which is fairly new open source project, aimed to deliver SBOMs, so software bill of materials, allow you to manage your inventory and all your dependencies, which have an active management of the supply chain. And I think, Cyclone DX has been around for like 2 or 3 years maybe, and it moved under OWASP a year ago, and it exploded. It's so much people joining that project because it really hits a nerve with the industry. people were looking for something, you might have a commercial offering for that. You might have a tool for that. But if you don't, then it's a new problem for you. What you're going to do, you look at existing open source offerings. And I was very happy to see that OWASP has an offering for that as well. So that helps in a big deal. For our project, what we try to do is we reduce dependency as much as we can, and we're in a good position, we can do that. And then CI/CD, continuous integration, testing. And we run on different platforms, so we're expanding that testings now to make sure that not only the reference platform, but additional platforms are supported as well, and they all run equally well. We have published a demo site, a sandbox, run online software. We run in the cloud if you want. And there is now a demo that you can try for yourself. Does this project deliver what you're asking for? And things like that, opening up, being more transparent, and also maybe joining a bug bounty program, that all helps with continuous testing of your software. And I think that ultimately is part of a bigger application security program, different components that add to it, also complement each other sometimes. And then you're always running behind, I guess. We try to make a good job, and we find vulnerabilities, we fix them, and the next day is a new game, and salts are over again.
Right, push the rock back up the hill. So,
yeah.
Dave, it sounds like many of these fixes come back to governance, to rigor, to methodology. And it strikes me that many organizations have very rigorous procurement organizations that when they buy and they put things into production, or they're doing manufacturing level sourcing, that they have these regulations and these mandates in place. But somehow software development is different. We don't think of software as procurement. We don't think of getting your procurement department involved with software development necessarily. Is that something that has to change? And is the way we do software development and the way it's just sort of evolved on its own part of the problem here?
Yeah, I mean, we put more rigor into vetting gravel, if we're a concrete manufacturer, than we do in vetting software that's going to be dependent on, that we're going to have our major systems dependent on. I mean, what I'm hearing is, and out there in the industry right now, is the right way to go. We need to be systemic about how we're dealing with all of our software, and it can't be whack-a-mole. We can't say, okay, we got a security issue here, or a supply chain software issue here, and therefore we knock that down, and then 20 other problems arise. So this needs to be continuous security testing. This needs to be systemic to everything that we do. This needs to be part of the DevOps chain. This needs to be part of the quality chain. Checks need to occur when we check software in. Checks need to occur when we integrate the software. Checks need to occur when we do component testing. And we're able to automate this, so it really doesn't extend the cost and the risk much more to do this. But it does require people to take a different holistic approach into terms of how you deal with software and the vulnerabilities that are there. Most people who build products were already doing this, really kind of as a core discipline. And it was few and far between. As in my days of being a product CTO, I insisted on it that, we go through and test and look at the various components and make sure that we're building the system with components that aren't necessarily going to corrupt the system. Now we're dealing with much more complexity. We're dealing with things that are, have maybe 100 different, service components in it. Some of them are open source, some of them are proprietary built, some are, built by other vendors, some are, and the reality is we have to have some sort of a top-down quality control mechanism that's in place where we're treating all of it with suspicion, and we're going through and testing it with suspicion. That's not happening these days. And I think we're going to get in more trouble before we figure this out. I think people are going to realize that the risk is going to fund the ability to take a different approach, holistic approach to doing it, different tooling, look at continuous development, look at a systemic solution, stop playing whack-a-mole.
Sudeep, in order for us to get to that systemic solution, it seems like we need a common framework of observability, of understanding what's in place, of inventory. It's one thing to put in a regulation, it's another to actually be able to execute and know. So, we encounter this a lot at Traceable, where people just have no clue about what APIs they're using, or how they're being used, or what data they're accessing. Is there, as part of the systemic approach, how important is it for people to actually know what's going on within their system?
Yeah. So Dana, I think visibility and cataloging are always the key first step for getting an understanding of all the different components that they're using, whether it's for software composition analysis or for subsequent risk analysis for any of the components. But this may sound like a plug for Traceable, but the first thing our customers do is to get a complete inventory of their APIs, right? So because that is something which has been in the cloud security world, and now in the API security world, we see the same problem, because the adoption of cloud services or the adoption of APIs is very high. But the inventory aspect, or understanding the risks associated with what are the APIs you're using, are they things that you built in-house, or are they third party, are they OSS, what are the dependencies? That is not at the level that we would like, both as an industry as well as for specifically for customers in fintech or retail, where the stakes are high, and anytime there's a breach, then you're talking of millions of dollars at stake here. So once the assets are known, the risk posture can be built around them, depending on the sensitive data that they carry, exposure to the internet, exposure to third parties, exposure to partners, and the type of users accessing them, right? So that always has to be the key, where you understand the risk posture and what is the blast radius if there is attack on any of these assets. So, and that's what we saw with Log4Shell, and we are seeing the same thing repeat with Spring4Shell now, where most of the customers don't necessarily have that inventory of the external facing applications, or which are the ones which have sensitive data going through them. And that is now becoming the first order of the day, wherein you have to prioritize which are the issues to fix, because in many a case, especially with things like Log4Shell, which was so prevalent, you might have thousands of instances in your software repository, and some are direct and some are indirect. So building that catalog and then ensuring that you are having a runtime view of where the attacks could possibly come in from, and then starting from the prioritization, is becoming very important.
Yeah. Hey, Jim Hietela, when it comes to governance and fintech and the financial industry, there's often a lot of compliance requirements, auditing and regulation. Is regulation part of the solution here, or is it too late? Is this the Wild West where software can't be regulated? To what degree are top-down requirements and audits necessary, or is this not something that's the right tool for?
I mean, I guess my perspective is that the regulations tend to lag behind reality. So it is a bit of the Wild West right now. I don't know that we'll see regulations show up anytime soon that will help fix the situation. I'll also say, so we're a standards organization, open source, large scale open source development projects in a couple of our forums right now. So we're grappling with this in the same way that a large IT organization would, and our members are having to figure out the governance aspect and how to actually secure the code that in many cases is coming from other open source projects and being built into a data platform that we're building for the oil and gas industry, or that our members are building for themselves, the oil and gas industry. So we're almost grappling with this as an end user organization as well. So
I think it's something we're all dealing with at some level or another. With that, one of my most powerful tools in explaining things to people is through examples, to show rather than just tell. So I want to go around our panel and ask people if they have an example, a use case. They don't necessarily have to name the organization, where they have faced these issues of open source, the procurement and use of managing the balance between all of the resources that can be available, but managing which ones should be available. Let's start with you, Christian. Any examples of how we can look at others who have solved this or are dealing with it responsibly?
Good question. No, I think I'm turning the stick around because I'm on the open source end. So what I do is I approach people and say, hey, look, we're a vital part of your supply chain. If we're out, your product no longer exists. Why don't you think about that problem and talk to us? And then sometimes it works. And sometimes they go, oh, yeah, actually, you're right. We talk to our engineers and they confirm, but you're telling to us, let's sit at a table and look at a common future. Let's do a partnership here. And others just ignore that problem. And then what I see is they come around it now, that it starts to move. I mean, we had or used of our software, integrators of our software for 10 years, and they always refuse to talk to us. But we take your stuff, we sell your stuff, we make money off your stuff, but we don't want to talk to you. And this changes now. So I think there is a new approach to this. So they realize it's a problem, and Log4j certainly opened many doors in this regard, because they say, hey, who heard of Log4j before? The insiders did, but all the other companies depending on it never heard of it. What's that? Why are we at risk because of something we have never heard of? And I think it starts to click in many people's heads. And more close to your question, no, I cannot really give an example, because that's not one of the problems I deal with my customer.
That's fine. Dave Linthicum, excuse me, any use cases or examples that you've encountered of organizations that do this well, do it right, that maybe we should follow their lead?
Yeah, we're finding that they end up having a complexity problem that leads to a security problem, not a security problem that just becomes unto itself. So if you look at the holistic design patterns that are leading up to people having a security issue that they typically find, they have too many moving parts and not enough automation and abstraction in dealing with it. So my advice on how people deal with this and reduce the risk, fortunately, people haven't been affected by a software supply chain security issue, but they are arming themselves to deal with it right now, is to leverage as much automation as you can. We talked about the DevOps and the tool chains and things like that. So make sure you do the right testing and things like that. Automation and abstraction, observability in place. That doesn't mean throw tools and money at it, but look at this as a whole new approach. In other words, if we're going to integrate these 500 different components, that becomes a major system that's going to run our business, then what do we need to do to ensure those components are not going to have any kind of malicious characteristics to it? We can obviously, hire 1,000 programmers and have them go line by line to audit the system. That's going to be too slow. But the ability to look at systemic automation of these various stuff and look at it from an approach perspective in dealing with the mitigation of complexity, which is really what you're dealing with, and getting this down to automation and abstraction to deal with complexity, really is the only way I see people solving this problem. I mean, there's 10 ways to do it. 9 of them are too expensive and too complicated that people will never do. And so the easiest one is going to be to weaponize technology to fight against people who are weaponizing technology against you.
Right. Sudeep, you come at this from a couple of different angles, right? You're a consumer of open source software, but you're also helping people protect their organizations. So do you have any examples either on the buy and demand side or the supply and solution side as to what seems to work well?
Yeah, see, as in if I go back to, all these years in the security industry, one of the things that I've seen work well, and I've seen some of the larger tech companies do this, is they treat all software equally, right? Whether it is open source or whether it's things that they've developed internally, it all goes through the hardening process. It all goes through the same testing and rigorous testing many a times before they are incorporated into any of their dev pipelines. So that is one thing I saw some of the high-tech companies do very well, because they were at a point where it was becoming indistinguishable on where the software was coming from. So they just took the moral high ground to say that whatever we are doing with regards to software composition analysis or SAST or DAST or any of the testing that we are going to do, we will make sure that we will treat all the software which is being used equally. And then if it means that some of the open source libraries or source code has higher vulnerabilities, then that will not make it in, right? As in, if you cannot get the developers of that open source library to fix them at the rate that some of these high-tech companies need, then either their developers fix it and contribute back, or they just make a choice to not use that software.
Same question to you, Jim Hietela. What have you seen work, and where can we go for examples of how to do this better in terms of a holistic, more automated, more, I guess, complete way of managing our software supply chain?
Yeah, so the one example I would cite is the OSDU Forum, who are building an oil and gas data platform, using open source components, using open source development. They're building security testing, code scanning into their development process. So it looks a lot like a large enterprise would look if they were taking the security testing issue seriously. So that's probably the example it's furthest along inside of our organization that's doing this.
I want to revisit one of the topics that came up earlier, and that's the human resources part of this. Jim, at the Open Group, you all have a great deal of educational resources. You do certifications. And what kind of people do we need to help ameliorate this problem from the point of view of we'd like to hire them, we'd like to bring more resources to solutions around software acquisition, use, and monitoring, but what kind of people and what kind of skills are required? So from a organization that helps usher people into these careers, what kind of careers are we talking about, and what sort of what should people be thinking about from a career perspective in terms of the demand around managing software in organizations?
So I guess I would say there's different categories of people and skills that will be needed. There's certainly people that understand security at a very technical, very deep level. And there's all sorts of standards and certifications that are out there from various organizations, ISC Squared, SANS, GIAC. There's lots of educational opportunities and certification opportunities for people to get the skills they need to be proficient in performing, whatever security task you're talking about, whatever security role you're talking about. I think there's also people need to be kind of critical risk thinkers and be able to quantify risk and then speak risk to the C-level inside of their organizations. That's a whole nother area that at the Open Group we called Open Fair, based upon the FAIR methodology, and have trainers who train on it and a certification that goes with it that really helps organizations to quantify how much risk they have in a given area. So those would be two, and I think this is a really complicated area. So it takes people who can understand the big picture and understand where all the risk is from these interdependencies of code and supply chains.
Yeah. Hey, Dave Linthicum, I want to just drill down a little bit in something that Jim brought up, which is why aren't the people in the C-suite perhaps as involved with this as they should? Is there a gap between the need in the organization at large and what priorities the leadership has in many organizations?
Yeah, I think the main reason they're not involved in it is they don't understand it, and it won't become a priority until it becomes a major blow to the company. So in other words, if something hits the news cycle, which I think many supply chain security vulnerabilities have in the last couple of years, and we're going to see more of them moving forward. And unfortunately, I think people kind of operate in that kind of reactionary prioritization. The reality is that the CIOs and the CTOs in the organization should be on top of this and asking the questions. And my big concern would be if those people are not understanding the problem and aren't taking actions now to make sure this becomes a something you're able to do protection on. Boards, directors, and CEOs, they have lots of things to concern themselves with. I think that they hire competent people to defend themselves against these sorts of issues, and I think they rely on those people. And I think that's the way it's going to continue on moving forward. Whether that's right or not, that's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah. All right. Well, coming up towards the end of our time, so I wanted to address a couple of questions. One has come in through our chat, is basically asking how can we better finance open source? I guess it gets to the point of you get what you pay for. The entire industry depends on components that are maintained by volunteers. Maybe volunteers isn't the right way to go. What do you think, Kristen?
maybe you guys are familiar with the famous cartoon by XKCD with the guy running a library project in his basement. So the cartoon is a huge building, and it depends on a little component that a guy runs in Nebraska in his basement. I think it's very typical. I think it's a very good visualization of the problem here. Now, companies have a hard time paying for something if they can have it for free. So why would they? I mean, you have to tell them, you have to really rub it. Look, this is important for you. And even then, I mean, the moment Heartbleed hit, I think OpenSSL was running maybe on 5 billion devices, and they got $2,000 in donations a year. So it's hard. And I think open source project, ultimately, they need to ask for that money. They need their users to ask their user, look, you need to finance us. If you want us to deliver security, this has to be run in a professional way, and we're not 2 volunteers in the basement. When I took over the project I'm running with 2 or 3 guys together as leaders, we defined we're not going to be volunteers working our ass off so big corps can profit from us. We want to deliver high quality, but this is a 2-sided game. So we want partnerships with the big users. We want to talk to them. We need their information, but they also need our software. So what we're doing now is we're actually approaching them, and it's like a sales process. You go, look, we know you're selling our stuff, you make a revenue on this, and we want a share of it to improve our posture, to deliver something better. It's going to profit your competition as well, but that's the part of doing open source, or using open source software. If you don't like that, then develop it yourselves. And we're finding not really open doors, but it kind of works. But I guess you have to ask for it. So just asking companies to please be kind to these open source projects, and why would they? But if an important project knocks on the door and say, look, we know you're our users and we need you to get the following up and running, then I think they should at least answer that call. I think that is important. And if they're not, then we're entering a new phase. And yeah, I had such a case with an unnamed company. They started to piss on us. They were selling our stuff and they started to piss on us in advertisements. So, and we got really nasty there because we have a license that allows them to use our software, but the license doesn't say I have to be nice with them. Right. And they depend on us. So we really have leverage. So I was troubled there, and it took me 5 days, and I was sitting with the CEO at the table, and they stopped immediately. So I think they have an open ear, but you have to go and talk to them. The companies are not approaching open source project by themselves.
Right. So Jim Hietela, it sounds like, open source and the community and the ability to get a lot of people contributing has got, some great success stories and a long legacy. But maybe it wasn't really designed for mission critical, highly secure environments. Is there a mismatch? I guess I'm asking between the business model of open source and the real world as it exists today.
I guess I would just say that there are different business models in open source. There are certainly projects that are kind of grassroots things that spring up. And Christian has talked about the challenges of getting financing into a project. At the Open Group, the open source things we're involved in, we've tended to collect large end users first and get the ecosystem behind a project. And when you do that and you have the right industries involved, they understand the criticality of security. They understand they're going to have to put money into it. They understand that open source doesn't mean free. So, there's a spectrum of these things, and the business models are different, different at each end, and they're different across whether it's the Open Group or some of the foundations that are out there doing open source projects. Many of them have sponsor levels where people are paying to be involved and help influence the direction of the project. So,
right, there's a lot of times where these projects start fairly low key and pedestrian, but then need to harden and mature over time, and we've seen that. But there's a lag, and sometimes there's not enough impetus. But Dave Linthicum, we've seen other examples where very big, powerful, well financed organizations will put a project out there for a variety of motivations. Some of them are competitive. I'm thinking of like Kubernetes, for example. When you look at how pervasive and powerful and important that is, and it started from one vendor saying, maybe we'll disrupt some of our competitors, but then maybe that project doesn't get funded or financed or managed. Is there a problem with the way bigger companies endow the open source community with software too?
Well, I think that they actually have a positive effect on the open source stuff. If you look at Kubernetes specifically, so instead of making a proprietary system, which probably meant that probably wouldn't have gone as far as it did in the marketplace, they put it out in the marketplace and open it up and let other people contribute to it. And therefore, people adopted it because it was open and not necessarily that it was it is. It was a very good container orchestration layer. But they adopted it for lots of business reasons, lots of technical reasons, and the ability to really kind of control their destiny. So people who adopted it know that they could actually get the code at some time and make the changes they need, therefore protecting themselves and reducing their risks. In other words, if a vendor got greedy or they went out of business or they were bought by a competitor or something like that, they wouldn't have to undercut and change their underlying infrastructure around a business change from another organization. So there's that. To the point earlier, I mean, we need to finance up the supply chain. The thing is, I work with a lot of open source companies, and the ability trying to figure out, and Jim's right, the different business models that they're able to leverage. The reality is that people typically don't work for free. They don't do their best work for free, that's for sure. And we need to figure out how the money is going to move up the supply chain to make sure we're getting the quality and the security checks that occur. It's just going to be part of it. It can still be open, but we're just compensating the people for doing the work they need to do the particular systems to get us to supply us the software that's going to be in good enough shape to add value to the business. And it's a win-win.
Yeah, it's something like a bug bounty, but on the other side, on the developer side, on who is willing to take on the gauntlet and actually fix issues in open source software, have some sort of a bug bounty there for exposing and then fixing the issues themselves, and then contributing it back into the open source software before it is consumed en masse. Some of those have been discussed in different forums that, before you open up your open source software, can you have some, third parties come and validate that, right? But all of these have been on the drawing board or have been in discussions, but they have not actually been enforced yet.
Well, clearly a lot more to talk about. I'm hoping that we were able to raise the awareness and perhaps elevate some of the urgency around these issues. I'm sure we'll be returning to this in the not too distant future, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for today. So a big thank you to API Days, Night Events, and all the APIsecure conference sponsors. Thanks as well to our audience for joining this live discussion on the risks and rewards of developing with and deploying on openly available software and services. Please see more on managing risk at the Open Group and in Deloitte Consulting's websites. And lastly, a big thank you to our panelists. We've been here today with Christian Folini, security engineer at Netnea and a major project manager in the open source arena. Thank you. We've also been here with Jim Hietela, Vice President, Business Development Security at the Open Group. Sudeep Padiyar is founding member of the product management team at Traceable AI. Thanks to you. And also a big thank you to Dave Linthicum, Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte Consulting. That's all there is for this roundtable, folks. I'm Dana Gardner, Director of Content at Traceable. Have a great rest of your API Secure conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So long.
Bye now.
Thanks for having me.